Hi, my name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week I will research one topic, and by the end of the episode, I hope to truly have the answer to the question, how did that happen? Hello, and welcome to another episode of How Did That Happen? This week, we are discussing vinyl. Not the stuff on the side of your house, we're talking about records. Come along for the ride this week as I ask, vinyl records, how did that happen? Okay, so since I've been doing this for a couple months now, I figured I would I'd take the time to just say a little bit about myself since, I realized I'm like, this is episode 15, and all you guys really know about me is my name and what my voice sounds like. So I'll say born and raised in Virginia. I've spent some time outside of Virginia, but been living in Virginia for most of my life. I've been around the country. I went to college in Virginia as well. Went to the University of Virginia's College at Wise. I currently live in Richmond, Virginia, and that's pretty much that's pretty much me. My degree is in communications. Yeah, there's not a whole lot to it, and I wasn't trying to get really deep or anything. I just realized it would be a little bit helpful. I was just trying to grow and keep growing with this podcast to just I don't know, be a little more I guess vulnerable. I don't know, but to just say who I am and let you guys know who you're listening to, so you can I guess know more about me. And on to the podcast. Before we get into the history of vinyl, it might be interesting to understand what type of vinyl is used to make records. Most records created today are made using what's called PVC, or polyvinyl chloride. It's supposed to provide a richer sound than what was originally used, and what was originally used was shellac. Originally, the sound was recorded on discs made of shellac, which were sometimes called grooved gramophone discs, but shellac is much shorter, so that's just what I'll use. The shellac was a type of wax that was heated and hardened before they created the sound, and they created the sound by adding the grooves to the heated and hardened wax, essentially. I found a video on YouTube that probably explains it way more than I just did, and I'll go ahead and post that on the Twitter page. Okay, since we talked about what it's made of, now we can actually get into how it happened. So there was a man named Edward Leon Scott de Martinville, and he patented what is called the phonograph in 1857. Martinville was a printer and a bookseller, and he was said to have been inspired to make this after reading about the anatomy of the human ear. It just interested him so much that he tried to make basically a creation of that. The phonograph is supposed to be an analog of the ear canal, in his vision, I guess. It had a funnel-like form or a small open-ended barrel with a parchment or some other suitable material stretched over the small end, and then a pig bristle traced a line through a thin coating of lampblack on a moving surface of paper or glass, so the air vibrations would be recorded by the moving bristle on the lampblack. It is this technology that became the fundamental principle of vinyl recording. Thomas Edison invented the phonograph in 1877, and with tinfoil wrapped around a metal roll, it could be used, or it could be turned with a hand crank. And so using an acoustic horn, the sound vibrations would then become pressed against a membrane, and that would start to vibrate. This membrane was fitted to a steel needle that could carve the vibrations into the tinfoil as it turned. Initially, one could only record for about a minute at a time before having to change out the tinfoil, and that would turn out to be like one of the bad features of this product. I mean, which you can already kind of see that. But when Edison exhibited the phonograph, he referred to it as a speaking machine. That's what he called it. One of the first things he said into the phonograph was "Mary had a little lamb," and he kind of went on about that. And it actually there's a video of that on YouTube, and I will post that so you can see. And then they literally have the recording of what he said. It's actually pretty wild because they did record it. It went into commercial production in 1887, but it was not a super hit because, like what I said earlier, due to the smaller amount of recording time, it was lacking in sound quality as well. I mean, if you can only record it for like a minute, I mean, even then people were like, yeah, we never heard of this before, but can you do a little longer? What followed the phonograph was the gramophone, which was created by this guy named Emil Berliner, or Berliner. don't know. Hope you're getting that right. Berliner, what I'm going to call him, was a German American inventor who went toe to toe with Edison during those days. He even created one of the first microphones, which was called a carbon button microphone, and sold it to the Bell Phone Company. And this is all documented in a group of U.S. Supreme Court trials that are called the telephone cases, which sounds like a good podcast title to me. I mean, someone should look that up. But it details the creation of the telephone and who actually gets the credit for its invention. It's like a whole group of trials. You can look that up and see. In 1887, Berliner patented a device called the gramophone that would record sound on discs. The markings made by the needle were recorded in soot, and then after recording, they were varnished and used to photo engrave the grooves onto a metal disc. Initially, they used 5-inch discs with a hand crank and were sold as children's toys in Europe. They could not be sold in the U.S. due to the issues with the patents being pending, but eventually he is allowed to sell them in America, but the hand crank as well as the technology did not make them a top seller. He gets them from Eldridge. He gets help from Eldridge Johnson to get rid of the hand crank, but Berliner had other troubles in the form of competition in his own company. The people he licensed to sell his products were selling their own knockoffs as well, which was basically eating into his own which was basically eating into his profits. And eventually, he gives up on this line of business and leaves the country. Berliner sells the rights of his invention to Eldridge Johnson, who goes on to found the Victor Talking Machine Company, and they sell the disc that Berliner had been trying to perfect. The Victor Talking Machine Company created the Victor Victrola, which was the first internal horn machine, because up until then, the horn used for listening was always out and visible. Up until this point, all music that was recorded was done acoustically. The musician or singer would sing into a large horn connected to the recording device, and it would take down the vibrations just like the phonograph. With radio coming into favor in the early decades of the 20th century, acoustic phonographs were becoming old news. The idea of electrical recording was pioneered by Western Electric, which would come to be owned by AT&T. Western Electric showed their technology to both Victrola and Columbia because they were both the leading acoustic phonograph makers. They were both initially reluctant because they realized that if they went with this technology, it would make their entire inventory obsolete because it required the acoustic, phonograph technology. But eventually they gave in. And in 1925, Victor debuted the orthophonic system, which was the first consumer phonograph designed specifically for electrically recorded phonograph records. In 1925, Victor debuted the orthophonic system, which was the first consumer phonograph designed specifically for electrically recorded phonograph records. Its starting price was $95, which would be like $1,400 in today's money. They also dabbled in the creation of sound for early movies, for motion pictures, and that will actually come into play later. Not really in this podcast, but more like in the arc of the company of RCA. The company Victor, was sold to the Radio Corporation of America, better known as RCA, in 1926. RCA, which was initially owned by a number of different companies, including GE, over the next 40 years would become, they basically own the space in audio technology. They were initially created as a nationalist vision by the government in response to growing audio advancement overseas. I know that sounds like a lot, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but you can look it up and it is actually there. RCA began selling the first all-electric Victors in 1930, and the next year they introduced 33.5 revolutions per minute long play record. This was a commercial failure, partly because it was released during the Great Depression, and also because the vinyl was being used with substandard. It would crush sometimes under the heavy tone arms that were being used at the time. So basically, they were just making stuff that wasn't able to be played in the actual record players they already had. A couple of years later, RCA released the Duo Junior, which was a smaller record player that resembles the ones we see actually today. It is almost briefcase sized, and the top opens up, revealing the record and the needle, and it has a cord that plugs into the wall. Looks basically like the ones you would see in the store right now. These were said to be given away with the purchase of a certain number of records, and they are credited with revitalizing the record industry after the Great Depression. In 1947, RCA released the 45, of course, which is that's 45 revolutions per minute, the 45 RPM single record, as a response to Columbia's creation of the successful 33.5 long play, which, like we said earlier, did not work for RCA when they created it. So the two would eventually adapt each other's technology. It would only take a couple years, and so that's how we ended up getting all of the different types of records that we have, and even today. You still just really have like 33 and a half. You got the 45s and like the 78s. There's not really much more than that. But that's really kind of just where this podcast ends as far as like the idea of vinyl. It's not really about what the different types that were made after this or whatever happened with it. It's more just like how do we go from not having it to having it, and who kind of set the standard and what created it that. And we see that it was basically RCA in Colombia. This podcast mainly focused on RCA, and that's just because the information I found was pretty RCA centric. But I would say definitely it was those two companies and the people that they bought the technology off before that, those guys that were trying to invent this stuff. But it's crazy that we're still using basically the same technology. And that is how vinyl records happen. And now it's time for the roundup. And we're going to round it up. A guy named Eduardo Scott de Martinville patented the phonograph in 1857. It's a big horn that records what it hears on glass or paper with a pig bristle. Edison creates the phonograph, which is a better version of Martinville's invention. After that comes the gramophone, which is sold to Eldridge Johnson, who owns the Victor Talking Machine Company. In 1925, the Victor Talking Machine Company releases the first electrically recorded records, leaving phonographs in the dust. RCA buys the Victor Talking Machine Co. the next year, and they create the 45 RPM single. Columbia successfully creates the 33.5 LP. Things I didn't know before. One of the things that I didn't know before was that RCA created NBC. I did not know that RCA that they created NBC, which at the time it was the first nationwide radio network. Now RCA is just a brand name only, and it's licensed out by Sony, which is crazy because international competition like Sony is the reason RCA went out of business in the first place. So I didn't really know anything about this before, and so that when you see how it all kind of comes full circle like that, it is interesting. Another thing that I didn't know was that the first electrical recording produced ever was done for the public, and it was done to broadcast basically the funeral of the unknown warrior in England, in Westminster Abbey in November 1920. Like we talked about the difference between like the phonograph and the microphone. This was the first thing ever recorded with a microphone and put out to people, and that's just an interesting. I find that I definitely did not know that before. And this has been another episode of How Did That Happen? I am your host, Richard Dix. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, and I'll see you guys next week.